Alright guys, so I got another Piers Morgan dumpster fire here for y'all, where he decided to bring on Mehdi Hasan, obviously a former MSNBC anchor who was sort of pushed off of the network and is now actually going to start his own media enterprise that apparently is going to be called Zeteo, so I guess stay tuned for that. I think he's going to probably have some good content coming out of that. But anyways, they're going to talk about Israel and Gaza, and I think, as you know, is a consistent theme when it comes to Piers Morgan's interviews with people who are willing to be critical of Israel. Piers is just going to get absolutely obliterated in this. So let's go ahead and jump in, and I'll commentate my way through this.
Let me just take you back to October the 7th. I want you to imagine, and it's a bit of a leap, I admit, but I want you to imagine that you are the Prime Minister of Israel when that atrocity happens in Israel. What do you do?
That's a great question. So short answer is I resign, because I'm responsible for that attack. I'm the one who botched security at the border. I'm the one who propped up Hamas with money from Qatar over the years and allowed them to be propped up as a way to divide the Palestinian people. I'm the one who's had millions of my own people on the streets for months protesting against my authoritarian reforms to the judiciary. So I have some shame, I have some self-respect, I have some honesty, and I say, I quit. Let someone else do this because I've failed for 20 years.
Okay, so I mean, that's a very solid answer there. Honestly, it's probably not what would have initially jumped into my head. I probably would have said something in regards to, you know, having an underlying recognition of the problems of maintaining a decades-long apartheid and an occupation and an ethnic cleansing and now a genocidal campaign in the Gaza Strip, but even before that, maintaining a blockade on the Gaza Strip and keeping the people living there in essentially an open-air prison or a concentration camp, pick whatever term you like better. And you know, I probably would have said, like, having an underlying recognition of the inherent flaws of maintaining a violent state apparatus like that you know, that inevitably is going to return violence in turn. And so I probably would have answered in that way. However, he is 100% correct. Yeah, I mean, Benjamin Netanyahu, everything that he just said there in regards to him helping to try to prop up Hamas, to keep the Palestinian people divided, to prevent the possibility of a two-state scenario, that's all 100% true. I mean, if anybody in Israel is largely to blame for October 7th, it would be somebody like Benjamin Netanyahu. So yeah, resign in disgrace. He's 100% correct about that. His answer, and you know, obviously I know Mehdi Hasan's beliefs on this and his views on this, so I know that he would agree, but what his answer leaves out is that I think even if you had somebody who wasn't Benjamin Netanyahu in charge of Israel at the time of October 7th, they probably also would have, you know, responded in nearly as brutal of a way as Netanyahu has inside of Gaza. So it doesn't change the underlying structures, the oppressive structures towards the Palestinians, if Netanyahu is in place or if some other right-wing, you know, Israeli leader is in place, but the underlying point of his statement there absolutely stands. So let's see what Piers responds here with.
Netanyahu did not do that. And interestingly, although the majority of Israelis would like him to go, they also want him to finish the job in destroying Hamas. There's not much ambiguity in terms of how Israelis feel about the mission plan. But there's obviously a lot of concern mounting around the world about the scale of Israel's response. And that's really what I guess my question was alluding to. Yes. I'll be honest, I've said this a lot on my Uncensored show, that I felt a real moral quandary. You know, I can go back over tweets I've done back in 2014, where I said that Israel's response to provocation by Palestinians at the time was bordering on terrorism. You know, I'm somebody who, when I was editor of the Daily Mirror, opposed the Iraq War before, during, and after very vociferously, and I think that aged pretty well, that campaign. I'm somebody that when the Qatar World Cup happened, you know, I sprang to defence of Qatar's right to host the World Cup and exposed a lot of Western hypocrisy. And yet, when it comes to this particular conflict, I feel genuinely conflicted, for want of a better phrase. And the point of my conflict is this, really, is that the reason I asked you that question about if you were the Prime Minister of Israel, it's very, very difficult to know how any Prime Minister of Israel could have responded in a particularly different manner to the way that Netanyahu did. Putting aside all the reasons that you say he should have resigned, and by the way, I broadly agree with them. So, in terms of the Israel people, the Prime Minister at the time, the response to what happened that day was going to always have to be enormous, wasn't it?
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm going to let Mehdi respond here, but there was just so much within what Piers just said. Okay, notice how when he's talking about the IDF going into Gaza, completely obliterating the entirety of the north of Gaza to the point now where it's entirely uninhabitable, okay? To the point now where they've killed tens and tens of thousands of innocent civilians. A vast majority of the people they've killed have been innocent civilians. They've attacked hospitals, schools, mosques, UN shelters, refugee camps, everything you could possibly imagine. There have been credible allegations of widespread torture and even field executions. I mean, to look at that situation And to describe it as a moral quandary, right? Oh, I'm conflicted about this. Oh, well, back in 2014, I thought what Israel was doing was borderline terrorism, right? Notice how he's so questioning and skeptical when it comes to criticizing Israel. But then when he talks about Hamas, it's immediate for him. It's very easy for him to look at October 7th and say, they're a terrorist organization, they're evil, they're irredeemable, everything they've done is horrific, it was a massacre, it was all of that. And he has that very simple, very easy critique for Hamas, but then when it comes to Israel, it somehow in his mind becomes infinitely complex to the point where he can't make a real definitive statement on it, other than just like this ambiguity of like, well, I have some issues with it. It's like, no, I mean, if you have an issue with what Hamas did on October 7th, you can take every atrocity that they committed on October 7th, multiply it by about 100, and that's what we're looking like, or that's what we're looking at in Gaza. Okay, so it shouldn't be that confusing for somebody who has a principled stance on this. But let's hear Mehdi.
So you're right in terms of the emotional response. It was going to be enormous. And I would take us back to 9/11, Piers. You mentioned Iraq. After 9/11, there was an emotional response in the US that something had to be done, right? There's the famous Yes Minister dialogue. Something has to be done. This is something. Let's do it. And we invaded Afghanistan, which didn't solve the problem of terrorism, made it worse, punished innocent people who had nothing to do with 9/11. And you'll remember at the time, Piers, both parties in the United States supported going into Afghanistan. Only one member of Congress, not Bernie Sanders, Barbara Lee of California, voted to oppose that war. 2 decades on, many people would say.
And unfortunately, Barbara Lee just lost the Senate race in California. She was running against mainly Adam Schiff and Katie Porter, and then this other Republican, I can't even remember his name, not that it necessarily matters. Adam Schiff, the more corporate Democrat in the race, actually spent money to basically uplift the profile of the Republican in the race because it's an open jungle primary, so that he didn't have to run against the progressives like Katie Porter and Barbara Lee. So unfortunately, she didn't win that Senate race. I would have loved to have seen Barbara Lee as the senator of California, but we're stuck with Adam Schiff, unfortunately, for right now.
She was vindicated, even though she was an isolated voice, and she was going against a tidal wave of opinion from liberals and conservatives said we have to do something. And I get that. After an atrocity happens, people want to do something. But the best leaders, the most strategic leaders, the most moral leaders are the ones who can take a pause, take a breath, and say, are we going to make the situation better or worse? Are we striking out strategically or just for the sake of vengeance and revenge? And you talk about Israeli prime ministers having to do this. Look, they didn't have to do it on this level. I think a lot of Israelis, despite supporting Netanyahu, would argue it didn't have to be done like this. There are different ways to retaliate against Hamas. The irony is no Israeli government has done it like this before. This is the greatest death toll for Palestinians of any war in Israel's post-1948 history. So the fact that he did it like this was unique. I mean, look, the statistics speak for themselves, Piers. You know them. You've said them on this show. Yeah. The level of killing, the number of kids killed. You have one former UN official saying this is the highest kill rate in the world since Rwanda, right, of any conflict since Rwanda. Do not tell me that the only response to a brutal attack on civilians in Israel on October the 7th was to produce a conflict that had a kill rate equivalent to Rwanda's. Sorry, I don't accept that.
Here's what I would say, playing devil's advocate, and you might think, I'm literally playing devil's advocate, but I'm going to play it anyway, which is, all that is true. The death toll is horrific. The percentage of children being killed is horrific. But I would say, as a caveat to this, that if you think about it from the Israeli perspective, you've got 35,000 Hamas terrorists, and we'll come to whether you think they're terrorists or not in a moment, but you've got 35,000 Hamas soldiers, warriors, terrorists, whatever description you want to call them, depending on whose side you're on. And they are embedded amongst a civilian population where half that population is under 18. How else do you get rid of Hamas if you don't go about it in the blunt, brutal manner that Israel is doing? And if you do it the way they're doing it, how do you avoid the kind of casualty rate of people under 18, given that that's half the population?
It's just such an insane question, right? And he's going to make this argument later. But Piers just comes to this conversation, this kind of a question, with the absolute assumption and the faith in the IDF and the Israeli military apparatus and their government that they are doing a targeted campaign against Hamas, when they're not, okay? When he asks a question like, what else could they have done other than what they've done in Gaza in order to respond to Hamas's terrorist attack on October 7th. Okay, we're going to put the terrorist label, conversation here aside for a minute because they'll return to that. But the idea, again, that you can look at as far as the eye can see, destruction in Gaza, where people are now starving to death because of Israel's blockading of aid from getting into Gaza. Okay, where almost all of the civilian infrastructure in the north and a significant portion of the civilian infrastructure in the south has been completely obliterated. The idea that you can look at that situation and somehow try to say, well, what else could they have possibly done? I don't know. Maybe don't target civilians and civilian infrastructure? Step one? I mean, he comes to this conversation again with the assumption that this is a targeted campaign against Hamas when it's very clearly not, just based not only on what Israel's conduct in Gaza has been over the last 5 months, but what their politicians have been openly saying. How many different openly genocidal statements have I shown you guys? From Isaac Herzog, the president, from Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister, from Itamar Ben-Gvir, the national security minister, to Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister, to IDF soldiers who are on the ground, everybody you could possibly imagine, members of the Knesset, openly genocidal rhetoric for 5 months straight now towards the people of Gaza. And he's still confused about this, still asking, well, what more could they have possibly done to avoid? It's inevitable that they would have killed this many civilians, right? That's just a fact of war, apparently. Even though Israel is blowing past every modern historical record of warfare for the amount of civilians who they have killed in such a short period and the amount of civilian infrastructure they've destroyed in such a short period. But here's Mehdi.
So, 3 things very briefly. Number one, you do it by not deliberately targeting civilian targets and schools and hospitals and cemeteries and mosques and universities and churches. You don't have snipers shooting at hospitals or Christian women inside a church. That's how you avoid the casualties. Number two, I don't accept the premise of your question that this is the way to defeat Hamas. I think even if I'm an Israeli hawk, I criticize Netanyahu and say, this is not the way to defeat Hamas. This is actually absurd to think you can defeat Hamas in this way. We have countless episodes from history that show us this is not how you defeat a guerrilla movement, a resistance movement, a terror group, as you say, whatever words you want to use. In fact, you have Israeli generals saying this can't be done in this way. And number three, look, the reality is Hamas is a symptom of the problem. As long as you treat Hamas as the problem rather than as a symptom of the problem, you're never going to get rid of Hamas. Or if you do, by some fantasy means, get rid of Hamas, you'll just get another version of Hamas, because now you've got tens of thousands of orphans, you've got people who've lost their kids, their spouses, their siblings. What, you think they're not going to fight back in the years to come? You think they're not going to take revenge?
That's how I feel.
It's absolute madness to believe.
I feel the same way.
So we agree.
So yeah, I think broadly speaking, I do, because I think you can't kill the ideology, and in fact, all you will do is entrench the ideology. I think, and that's what I don't think Israel have thought through to a logical end game, which is you're not going to get rid of the thinking that inspired Hamas, because a lot of people will have suffered such appalling grief with their close family in the way you described that they're going to want to get revenge.
I think you're being a little too generous to the Israelis here, and with the greatest respect, I think your questions reflect a little bit of a naivety about what Israel's doing here. You're starting from the premise that Israel is trying to defeat Hamas. I don't accept that premise. I don't believe that's what Israel is trying to do.
What do you think they're trying to do?
They wouldn't be doing it this way. I think they're trying to take back Gaza. I think they're trying to erase the resistance in Gaza. I think they're trying to get rid of the people from Gaza. I think this is they've mowed the lawn, as they put it in previous wars. This time they're going in to erase the population. There's a plausible genocide.
Okay, but let me ask you that.
If you listen to Israeli officials, as you know, it's laid out in the South African petition, they are very genocidal in their approach to flattening and burning down Gaza. It's not about destroying Hamas. And if it was about destroying Hamas, why has Netanyahu and Smotrich and others talked about how Hamas is an asset to Israel? Why do they say that openly, Piers?
Well, he was clearly massively deluded, I think, Netanyahu, about having anything to do with Hamas. I think that Netanyahu's plan was quite straightforward, which was to separate Hamas from the Palestinian Authority and create a split in the Palestinians at an official level. And he thought that that was the best way of preserving security for Israel. He couldn't have been more wrong. I mean...
Okay, somewhat of a fair point there from Piers. I'm glad that he's able to recognize that that was a cynical strategy used by Netanyahu and other members of the Israeli government to try to divide and conquer the Palestinian people. However, you got to understand that this was not just an accidental sort of misplay on Benjamin Netanyahu's part in terms of, I shouldn't have trusted Hamas as much as I did. This was all part of that same strategy, right? To continue to expand the thousands and thousands of illegal settlements in the West Bank, to continue to, as Mehdi Hasan was just pointing out there, mow the lawn in Gaza, and now, since October 7th, to try to actually remove the Palestinian people from Gaza, making life totally unlivable within the Gaza Strip. And so it is just part of a broader strategy here. And so I do wish that Piers would have not just a critique for the methods that Israel is using in this war, or for Netanyahu as an individual, but for the broader structural issues that are at play here. And I think that that's the main difference between him and Mehdi.
The thing I do want to ask you, I don't think you've called Hamas terrorists. In fact, you've gone out of your way to call them fighters. Do you still think that, or do you accept that what they did on October the 7th was an act of terrorism on a heinous scale, and therefore you have to call them terrorists?
So you're wrong, Piers. In my very first MSNBC monologue after October 7th, I referred to what happened on October 7th as terrorism. In fact, when I was 16 years old, I wrote a letter to the Independent newspaper condemning Hamas bus bombings in the mid-1990s. So you're wrong on multiple levels. I don't expect you to know about my 16-year-old self, but clearly my MSNBC output is all there for anyone to see.
So just to be clear, it was an act of terrorism, and Hamas are terrorists. That's your position.
I think the Hamas fighters who went into Israel and killed civilians and kidnapped babies, certainly I would call them terrorists. Just as I call Israeli soldiers who kidnap children and kill children terrorists. I use the terrorist label more freely because otherwise it's just a politicized, empty phrase that we just apply to our enemies. What I would say, Piers, is that I find it a problem, and you know this, you've joked about all the memes about you, this obsession with what we call Hamas, which is a question you pose, let's be honest, Piers, to most of your pro-Palestinian brown guests. You don't ask your Israeli or Jewish or pro-Israeli guests to condemn Israeli terrorism or Israeli war crimes at the start of an interview in the way you do.
I've been asked directly whether I think Israel are terrorists, and I've said no. So I don't think they are. I think they had a right to defend themselves. The question is the scale.
That wasn't the point I made, Piers.
I
said when you have Israeli guests let me finish my sentence.
No, Mehdi, it's not your show. It's mine. I wanted to say that the whole interview, by the way. So we got that out of the way. That's a joke. I'm joking. But the point I would make is I think that I asked all the pro-Palestinian guests who've come on that question quite quickly because I think it reveals a state of mind. If, like you, and I'm sorry, I didn't realise you had in that first piece on MSNBC done that. So I take back the suggestion you hadn't. And I'm glad that you have called them that. I don't think you can call them anything else. So the moment you have a pro-Palestinian guest who wants to avoid calling what Hamas did an act of terrorism by terrorists, I think it's very revealing about their mindset. And I think it's the wrong mindset.
Here's my problem with that. Why is that not applied to your Israeli guests? I would be fine, Piers, if you had Palestinian guests and you begin by asking them, do you condemn Hamas war crimes? Because what Hamas did on October 7th was a war crime. But then you should start with Israeli guests and pro-Israeli guests saying, do you condemn Israeli war crimes, which have been documented by the UN, every human rights group on the planet. You don't. You had Naftali Bennett, the former Israeli Prime Minister, on a couple of weeks ago. I watched the interview. Your opening question was, how comfortable are you with the way Israel's prosecuting the war? Bit of a softball to start with. You didn't ask him to condemn Israeli terrorism, Israeli war crimes, Israeli genocide in Gaza. So a lot of people look at that and they say, they get your intention, but it comes across as a bit of a racist double standard.
Well, I don't think it's a racist double standard, and I think that nobody has given pro-Palestinian voices a bigger platform more consistently since October the 7th than me. And if you go back and look at those interviews, I think that clips get taken out of context and people assume they know what I've said. And often it's completely misleading. I've tried to be fair-minded about it. People do ask me, do you think Israel are terrorists? And I've said no. I don't think they are. But I have repeated...
Why?
Well, I have repeated...
Why?
Because I think they...
Out of interest, why?
Because they were responding to an act of terrorism so heinous, it demanded a massive military response. The question for me that's caused me a moral quandary is what is an acceptably proportionate level of response? And I don't know the answer. But I don't think you can call people responding to an act of terror on that scale terrorists for responding. What you can do is hold them to account.
The problem, Piers, is if you go to Gaza, Piers, and you talk to Palestinians, they will say that Hamas were responding. If we play the who started it game, we go back many decades.
Well, when did Israel kill?
What we need to have is.
Hang on. When did Israel kill 1,200
When did Israel kill hundreds of Palestinian civilians?
When did they kill 800 Palestinian civilians in one few-hour period? Right, in the way that Hamas killed those Israelis.
But that's not the definition of terrorism, how many hours you do it in. I can mention many Israeli massacres going back to Sabra and Shatila, which they oversaw, going back to Kibbutz and Ariel Sharon, going back to Deir Yassin, where rape and violence happened. The point is not to compare atrocities. The point, Piers, is to have a consistent moral principle, which is to say, if you kill civilians for a political cause, you are a terrorist. On that basis, Hamas have committed acts of terror and Israel have committed acts of terror. I think that's only fair to say that.
Yeah, listen, you're perfectly entitled to say it. Of course you are. At the Oscars on Sunday.
Okay. I mean, it's unreal. It is unreal. Now, I understand. Piers Morgan, he wants to portray himself as some sort of a neutral arbiter of these kinds of conversations and debates. He wants to portray himself as an objective observer who doesn't have underlying biases when it comes to this issue. But when you have such a glaring dichotomy or contradiction, when you talk about one side versus the other, it's hard to come away with any other conclusion than, yeah, you are wildly biased on one side of this equation, and that is the Israeli side. Now, notice how when Mehdi Hasan is pressing him there, and he says, why? Why would you not call the IDF terrorists, right? What's your reasoning for that? And his follow-up question is to be like, when did Israel kill civilians in the same way that Hamas killed civilians, and also within a couple-hour time period like Hamas did, and when has Israel done that? It's like, you just completely warped and changed the actual definition of what terrorism is. And so I'm glad that Mehdi clearly stated that and pointed that out. The definition of terrorism is committing violence, particularly against civilians, for a political purpose, right? So by that definition, you could call Hamas, any Hamas members who went into Israel and they killed civilians or kidnapped civilians, you could call that an act of terrorism, okay? But then if you have a difficulty in recognizing that Israel then responding to that by going into Gaza and doing 100, 1,000 times more when it comes to killing civilians, maiming civilians, destroying civilian infrastructure explicitly for a political purpose, not a military purpose, a political purpose, then that is also terrorism. If you're going to call Hamas a terrorist organization, which is fine, I'm not going to sit here and argue with you on that, but then you also have to call the IDF a terrorist organization. And in fact, if we're being real about it, if Hamas is a terrorist organization, then objectively, by the same definition, Israel is a super mega terrorist organization. I mean, this is why I don't really like the political label of terrorism, is because it is typically, as he was arguing there, Mehdi, it is typically just used in a one-sided way against the enemies of the United States or the United Kingdom or Western European governments. That is typically when this phrase is used. And so I really don't care if anybody calls Hamas a freedom-fighting organization or a terrorist organization. I care about, the actual actions that are taken, right? And so you have to be consistent, whether or not you're going to call them a terrorist organization. If you are, you got to apply that same exact label to the IDF, right? And then another aspect of what he was talking about there, Piers claims that Israel was simply responding to an act of terrorism by Hamas. And Mehdi had a good pushback there, where he points out, listen, if you want to play this game of who slapped each other in the face first, who started it, then we can go back decades and decades and decades. I mean, we could go back to the early Zionist settlers who were coming before the establishment of the State of Israel, right? We could talk about the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 and the Nakba, which resulted in hundreds of thousands of Palestinians being violently displaced from their homes. We could talk about numerous different instances throughout the last 100 years or so and try to get to the root of who started it, right? I would argue the political project of the settler colonial project, really, of Zionism is what started it, if you want to get to the origins of this sort of tit-for-tat back and forth, right? If we're trying to get a real analysis of this here. But to claim that Israel is just responding to an out-of-the-blue, came from nowhere, why did this happen, okay, attack from Hamas on October 7th, it's just ahistorical, guys. Okay, for the last how many years, 16, 17 years, Israel has had a total blockade on the Gaza Strip. Even before October 7th, before Israel was blocking the aid from getting into Gaza to the point now where it's less than 100 trucks that are able to get in on a daily basis when they really need more like 1,000 trucks getting in. Okay, even before all of that, Gaza required upwards of 500 trucks a day in aid. Okay, why was that the case? Why is it the case that Gaza does not have a functioning airport or a seaport, for that matter, to the point now where the United States is claiming that they're trying to build some sort of a temporary floating pier seaport to skirt around the Israeli blockade to get aid into Gaza? Why is that the case? Could it have something to do with the fact that for decades now, Israel has either been directly occupying or effectively occupying the Gaza Strip and putting the people in Gaza in an absolute crisis for years and years and years, to the point where there is no, viable future for them to really have dignity and sovereignty and control over their own lives, right? That is the core of October 7th. And if you're not getting to the core of the apartheid, of the occupation, of the expansion of the illegal settlements, of the constant abuse and harassment and terrorism that Palestinians are subjected to on a regular basis, if you're not talking about the maintenance of an open-air prison or a concentration camp in Gaza, then you're just never going to understand what's actually happening here. And what's going to come from this, right, regardless of Piers asking the question over and over again to his more pro-Palestinian guests of, well, what would you have done in response to this? Regardless of him asking that question without ever seemingly learning the real fundamental answer there, on the current trajectory that we're on right now, what's going to happen? Well, in all likelihood, unless we somehow magically get a lasting ceasefire in place, which doesn't look very likely, unless that happens, we're going to end up with a situation where at least minimum tens and tens of thousands of more civilians inside of Gaza are going to die. As of this point, it doesn't look like Israel is going to be able to completely militarily destroy Hamas and remove them from power as of right now. Maybe that happens in the future. I highly doubt it. if we do get to the point where it does look like Israel is going to completely militarily defeat Hamas, then we're also looking at a hypothetical potential where Hezbollah in Lebanon gets more involved in the conflict. Then we're looking at a spiraling conflict that could spread throughout the entire region. So on the current trajectory that we're on right now, it looks like we are much more likely to end up with a horrifying humanitarian crisis, number one, and then also a spiraling conflict that could spread throughout the region, okay? Which may even end up getting the United States and our troops directly involved in this, more so than we already have been with sending weapons to Israel and giving them diplomatic cover and all of that. So that's the utter catastrophe that is on the horizon right now. And so when Piers just asks these questions to his guests over and over and over again, without recognizing that, like, yeah, if we're going to be real about it, the response to October 7th, okay, sure, if you want to go after the people who committed war crimes on that day, that's fine by me. I don't care. Give them to the International Criminal Court, prosecute them, also prosecute the IDF soldiers who have been committing war crimes over the last number of years. I'm totally fine with that as a process. But what needs to happen after that is you need to actually establish a real path forward for peace, lasting peace, okay, however Palestinians decide that they may want that to be formed, right? You have to actually approach that process in a good faith way, or this cycle of violence or whatever is never going to end. You are never going to get to the core root of it, right? And so we still have the Biden administration, who is fully backing and endorsing and arming and funding what Israel is doing right now. And, honestly, I mean, I have so many disagreements with Biden, so many, obvious criticisms of the Biden administration, especially right now on this specific issue. The Trump administration arguably would be worse, okay? Not that there's really anything redeemable when it comes to Biden's Israel policy, but the Trump administration may even be worse. He just recently came out and made a statement on all of this, one of the first ones that I've seen since October 7th. And he basically just said Israel needs to finish the job, right? Same as what Piers Morgan was saying the Israeli people want. Finish the job, whatever that means. We're not going to make any apologies. We're just going to allow them to do whatever they want. And so it's really difficult for me to try to give you guys like some sort of a positive spin on the current trajectory that we're on. I really do hope that somehow there is a lasting ceasefire that is put in place. Netanyahu is removed from power. There is some sort of a international coalition that comes together to criminally prosecute all of the leaders and those who are complicit in this genocidal campaign in Gaza. And then after that, you move forward with some sort of a forced peace settlement where Palestinians are given true dignity and sovereignty and control over their destiny and all of that. I wish that I could tell you guys that I see that on the horizon, but unfortunately, as Mehdi was just pointing out there, and as many others have as well, it just looks incredibly bleak. And so, credit, I guess, to Piers Morgan for continuing to have people like Cornel West and Norm Finkelstein and Mehdi Hasan on his program. I truly hope that he continues to do that. But at some point, please, Piers, I'm begging you to actually digest some of what they're saying, and to maybe adjust your own personal opinions on the matter, instead of just keeping this vague notion of having a moral quandary with what I think most reasonable people at this point can identify as a genocide. There shouldn't be anything ambiguous about that.